would you do if you saw yourself walking out the door while you were still sitting at your desk? A Reddit user named Trigger Happy Greg, which we'll talk about that later, worked night shifts at a small call center. One evening around 2 a.m., his coworker looked up and said, "Didn't you just leave?" Confused, Greg replied, "What are you talking about? I've been sitting here." The coworker swore she saw Greg walk past her office and out the front door. Same hoodie, same walk, same everything. They even checked the security camera, and sure enough, there was Greg walking out. But Greg had never left, and the security footage glitched right as he hit the parking lot. Erased, like someone never meant for him to be seen. Imagine someone who looks exactly like you, calling your dog by name and walking down your street like they live your life. A woman from Oregon shared a chilling story on a paranormal Facebook group. Her neighbor knocked on her door one evening, confused, and asked, "Why didn't you say hi earlier? I saw you walking Max." Only this woman had been inside all day. Max, her golden retriever, hadn't left the house. The neighbor was adamant, said she even waved and the woman waved back. Creeped out, she checked her doorbell cam and saw someone with her exact face walking Max past the house. But, conveniently, the footage froze just as the double turned to look at the camera. What if you called your own phone and someone answered? A man named Alex recounted this story about parallel universes. While looking for his missing phone, he used his partner's device to call it, and someone picked up. The voice on the other end said hello, but it was his voice. The same tone, same speech pattern. The voice said, "Don't come looking for me," and hung up. Later, Alex found his phone under the couch, completely dead. There was no missed calls, no records of an incoming call. It was as if whoever answered was using a different version of his phone. What if someone knocked at your door and you answered while you were still upstairs? This story comes from a Reddit user named Mirror Moments, who shared an experience from when she was a teenager. One afternoon, she was upstairs in her bedroom when her friend came over and rang the doorbell. Her mom wasn't home, so no one should have answered, but her friend said that someone did, and it was her. The other her opened the door, smiled, and said, "I'm busy, come back later," before shutting it quietly. The friend was so weirded out by the interaction that she texted her asking what was going on. That's when Mirror Moments ran downstairs in confusion, only to find the door still locked. Her friend was standing outside, pale and wide-eyed. She swore that it was her. The same hoodie, the same voice, the same smirk. It was her friend. She knows what her friend looks like. When they checked the security cam footage later, it glitched right at the time the door supposedly opened. No motion, no video, just static, almost like something or someone didn't want to be seen. Someone showed up at your house claiming to be you, and your family believed them. Redditor Pale Orange Sky posted that her younger sister swore she'd picked her up from school one day, drove her home, and even helped with her homework. The problem? Well, she was working a double shift that day. Her car was parked at her job, and she had proof. Time cards, and surveillance. But her sister described the car perfectly, described her outfit, described conversations they'd supposedly had. Quote, "You told me to stay away from the old tree in the backyard," her sister said. Only she'd never said that before. Or at least, not in this universe. What's up with that old tree? I want to know why the parallel universe version was so concerned about the tree. Something mysterious. You get home and the door's unlocked. Someone's in the shower. It's you! A man named James from Missouri told his story to a paranormal podcast. He came home after a weekend trip and heard the water running. He assumed his roommate was home early, but when he opened the bathroom door, he froze. Why would he open the door when he thinks his roommate is in the shower? It's a creepy roommate. Anyways. The person in the shower had his tattoo, his build, his voice. They both screamed. The other James bolted through the back door and then vanished. When he told his roommate later, the roommate casually said, "Dude, I thought you were already here. I talked to you like an hour ago." What if one day everyone acted like you weren't you? In 2016, a woman named Marissa shared an incident in a thread about identity glitches. She walked into work and nobody recognized her. Her boss claimed they'd already spoken that morning. Her coffee was already at her desk. Someone had clocked in with her badge 20 minutes earlier. She checked the security footage and saw a woman who looked exactly like her, wearing the same clothes, walking into the office and doing everything that she normally did. The footage froze as the real Marissa walked in. Her double was never seen leaving. When your reflection moves before you do, run. A man in the UK posted on a lucid dreaming subreddit that he was brushing his teeth one morning when he noticed something was off. His reflection wasn't synced. It blinked a little too early, tilted its head before he did, and then it smiled. And he hadn't smiled. He turned around and ran out of the bathroom, nearly slipping. When he went back later, everything looked normal, except for one thing. The toothpaste cap was off, but he remembered screwing it back on. I guess the reflection didn't. Someone showed up at the DMV pretending to be you. Honestly, that's not so bad. They can wait in line for me. That's totally fine. In 2019, a man named Eric from Pennsylvania went to renew his passport and was told, "We already issued it yesterday." Confused, he checked, and sure enough, someone with his name, birth date, and even address had already picked it up. He asked for the security footage and saw someone who looked exactly like him down to a scar on his cheek, but Eric had been at work, logged into his company computer at the time. He reported it, but authorities never found the imposter or the passport. That's like crazy to think that your parallel universe doppelganger could come here and steal your identity. Would it even be a crime? I mean, technically, they are you. Sorry, I'm just like really having a moment. Like, guys, let's think about that for a second. Would they be jailed if they caught them? Let's say, yeah, they caught them. Would they be jailed for trying to steal your identity, even though it technically is their identity too? I don't know. Let me know down below. What if you met your double and they acted like you were the intruder? One of the most disturbing stories comes from a woman in Australia who shared her experience on a podcast called Somewhere Else. While staying at an Airbnb, she swore she saw someone walking into the living room from the hallway. A woman with her exact face and clothes. They locked eyes. The other version of her whispered, "You're not supposed to be here," and then apparently just disappeared into thin air. She packed up and left that night. When she checked the Airbnb listing later, it had been removed. No record of the host, no record of her stay. Even her confirmation email was gone. Doppelganger stories aren't just eerie. They challenge everything we think we know about identity, time, and maybe even reality itself. Whether they're signs of a multiverse, glitches in our simulation, or something stranger entirely, one thing's for sure, these stories are more than just spooky coincidences. They're warnings. What if every doodle you made was actually a window into your future self? Since age 7, Alex has been idly sketching the same man's face, beard, top knot, shaven sides throughout school and college. For 3 decades, the image remained just a doodle, nothing like his own reflection. Then, a year ago, Alex rediscovered his old notebooks and froze. The face in those drawings was now his face, down to every whisker and hairstyle detail. He'd never changed his look to match the sketches, nor had he consciously remembered drawing them, yet here they were, trapped in time. Was Alex unknowingly crafting a portrait of his future self, or did the universe slip him a glimpse from a parallel life where this was already reality? What if your next-door neighbor never existed, except in your memories? In autumn 2012, Columbus nurse Danielle Miller pulled into her driveway and saw a moving van parked next to her longtime neighbor's home. She waved and yelled hello, but no one answered. When she asked around, other neighbors were baffled. There had been no resident there for over 10 years, and county property records showed the lot vacant since 2001. Danielle even found official tax bills listing the address as unassigned, yet her smartphone photos captured the moving truck, the name on its side, and the familiar porch of the house she'd known since childhood. In a single night, the entire residence and the person she'd shared block parties with vanished from every public record. Picture stepping onto a train that, according to every schedule shouldn't exist. In 1973, Boston commuter Mark Patterson regularly took the 7:45 p.m. line from South Station. One evening, bleary-eyed from working overtime, he boarded what he assumed was his usual train. 2 stops later, he glanced at the station sign and froze. It read Oldwick Junction, a station that shut down since the 1940s. Confused, Mark asked the conductor, who stared blankly and slapped his ticket, "All aboard for Oldwick," he said. When Mark disembarked at his apparent destination, the platform was bustling, but the schedule board listed no trains stopping there after dusk. Maintenance crews later confirmed the rails were decommissioned decades earlier. Mark's ride remains unexplained, leading him to wonder if he accidentally hopped into a parallel timelines commuter system. Think you remember every Sinbad movie? Think again. Ask anyone born in the late 80s if they saw Shazam, the 1990s comedy where Sinbad plays a genie granting hilarious wishes, and 9 out of 10 people will swear it's real. I've seen this movie. They recall promotional tie-in toys, VHS covers with Sinbad's face, even commercials with that unforgettable theme song. Yet no studio records exist, no scripts, no posters in Viacom or 20th Century Archives. Sinbad himself has denied starring in any such film, and no footage has ever surfaced. This Mandela effect anomaly suggests millions briefly flit into a universe where Sinbad's genie movie actually existed, only to return claiming it never was. How did a single letter disappear from every bottle of Febreze overnight? For years, people swore they bought Febreze, an air freshener spelled Febreze. Then one day, retailers everywhere stocked Febreze, with just one E before the Z. Complaints flooded consumer forums. They changed the name without telling us. Yet corporate archives show it's always been Febreze with one E before the Z. Even longtime employees admit they remember the extra E. Was this a simple rebranding, or did millions of shoppers briefly slip into a parallel market where that second E never existed? What if a dream could order your real-world actions? College student Priya dreamed 3 nights in a row of her roommate Sarah handing her an envelope at 3:33 a.m., urging her to open it right away. The very next night at 3:33 a.m., Priya awoke to find a delivery slip tucked under her door. On impulse, she retrieved the package from the lobby. Inside was a sealed envelope labeled "Open at 3:33 tomorrow." Heart pounding, Priya obeyed and found a letter from Sarah warning Priya not to take a certain bus trip, citing a recent accident in the news. What was odd was that the next day, Priya had a trip planned on this exact bus, and in a dark twist of fate, that day and that exact ride Priya had booked did crash minutes after leaving. Priya swears she dream-walked into information from a timeline where she'd heeded Sarah's warning days earlier. Have you ever looked at a building and seen something that couldn't belong there? Photographer Theo was snapping long exposure shots of downtown Chicago's skyline. He took 2 identical frames 10 seconds apart. Reviewing them later, he noticed in the first photo a gleaming glass tower that stood adjacent to the Sears Tower. In the second photo, same angle, same time, the tower was gone. When Theo rushed outside, the block looked unchanged. No extra skyscraper, no construction site. Neighbors had no memory of anything ever existing there. Records confirmed the plot was empty for decades. Theo insists his camera glimpsed a structure from another reality and that his lens just happened to catch its brief crossover. What if your doppelganger lives a life eerily parallel to yours, just miles away? In 2011, British IT consultant David Clark Googled his own name and found another David Clark living in Manchester with the same birthday, same middle name, and even the same job title at a rival tech firm. Intrigued, he reached out and discovered the other David had the same childhood nickname, had traveled to the same backpacking hostel in Thailand in 2005, and even shared a rare allergy to kiwi. Yet neither man had ever met or even knew of each other until that Google search. DNA testing confirmed that they weren't related. "It's looking like a mirror image of my life," David said. Was this an improbable coincidence, or did two parallel streams of Earth diverge, spawning twin lives in different locales? Have you ever walked into a library and checked out a book that shouldn't really exist? Librarian Maria Perez was reorganizing a decades-old archive when she stumbled on a title called The Eighth Sign of the Zodiac, published in 1978 by a local press. Curious, she tried to locate any record of the publisher or the author. Nothing. No ISBN, no reviews, no library listings anywhere else in the country. Even the author's name, Thomas Adler, turned up 0 hits. Maria flipped through the manuscript. It contained references to cultural phenomena that didn't exist until the 1990s, and when pressed, her library's old accession logs showed the book being catalogued in 1980, 2 years before anyone invented the ideas in its pages. Maria suspects the book slipped in from another timeline where those cultural milestones happened early. Could a single subway stop be the gateway to another world? New York City bus driver Ricardo Luna always ended his shift at the 23rd Street depot. One night he took a shortcut through the subway tunnel and noticed a dimly lit station sign that read 23rd Street, but the platform looked brand new, with shiny white tile and digital display boards. Ricardo walked through expecting to find the main concourse, but emerged instead onto an entirely unfamiliar street corner. Phone maps showed him near 57th Street. Panicked, he retraced his steps only to arrive back at the usual, worn-out 23rd Street exit. The renovated station had vanished. Ricardo insists he stepped into a parallel version of the subway, if only for a minute.
When James Leininger was just 2 years old, he started having violent nightmares about crashing in a plane. He'd wake up screaming about being stuck in a fire, or yelling things like airplane crash and the little man can't get out. During the day, he started naming aircraft parts most toddlers wouldn't know existed, things like drop tanks and Corsairs. He also kept saying he'd flown off a ship called the Natoma and that his name had been James. His parents eventually looked into it and discovered the USS Natoma Bay was a real World War II aircraft carrier. They found a pilot on its roster named James Huston Jr. who died in combat. The plane was shot down and exploded. James the toddler also named another pilot from that crew who was still alive at the time, and when they met, the child recognized him instantly. On top of that, James could recall specific events and details of battles that matched Navy records. His parents had never really talked to him about this stuff at home, and none of it was in any children's books. As he got older, the memories started to fade, but for a while, it seemed like this kid was actually remembering a past life. At 4 years old, Shanti Devi in India started insisting that she had another family in a different town. She told her parents she wasn't really their daughter, that her real name was Lugdi Devi, and she'd lived in Mathura, about 75 miles away. She said she died giving birth to a son and gave the full name of her husband, the town he lived in, what he looked like, and even the layout of their house. At first, everyone thought she was just making things up, but when they actually looked into it, her descriptions lined up. A man named Kedar Nath lived in Mathura, had a wife named Lugdi who died during childbirth, and had a son. When Shanti met him, she instantly recognized him and greeted him like she knew him. She also correctly pointed out places and people in towns she'd supposedly never seen. Word got around and the case became so well known that a commission was set up by order of Gandhi himself. They interviewed witnesses, retraced her claims, and found that almost everything she said had a real-world match. Cameron McCulley was a regular kid growing up in Glasgow, until around age 5 when he started talking non-stop about a place called the Isle of Barra. He claimed he used to live there in a white house by the sea with a black and white dog, and a family that he really missed. He talked about planes landing on the beach, his old dad named Shane Robertson, and how his old life had ended when he, quote, fell through. His parents had never even mentioned Barra before, but Cameron was convinced. Eventually they took him to the island, and it turned out there really was a white house by the sea, just like he described. But I mean, whatever, right? A white house, It's not like there aren't any other white houses in the world. Well, this one belonged to a Robertson family. Again, just like young Cameron had described. Cameron was walking around like he'd been there before, naming things and pointing out details that lined up with what he'd talked about before. There were no obvious signs of how he could have known any of this. And his memories seemed emotional, not just factual. It didn't seem like he was just repeating stuff. It was as if he was genuinely grieving a life he'd left behind. In 1987, a little girl named Purnima Akanayak was born in Bakumana, Sri Lanka. She was like most kids, except for the fact that she kept talking about being crushed by a heap of iron. She'd also always tell her mother things like people who drive over others are bad, which is of course true, but it was odd that she seemed particularly focused on that specific thing, driving over someone. And when her mom got upset about a car accident that had happened one day, Purnima calmly told her not to worry because she had also died in a crash. She said a big vehicle hit her and she never made it to the hospital. Things got weirder when she started saying she used to make incense, and their name had used to be Jinadasa. She also described 2 types of incense, how she made them, and how she used to walk around with her hands behind her back, supervising workers. She also claimed she lived across the river from a temple, which was over 140 miles away from her actual home. When her family finally took her there, she started pointing out familiar places and recognized people by name. And man she used to be, who'd died in a car accident, he was real. His name was Janadasa Pereira, and he died in 1985, 2 years before Purnima was born, when a bus ran him over while he was selling incense on his bike. And to top it off, she had a birthmark exactly where Pereira's chest had been crushed. Since childhood, Jenny Cochel would have recurring dreams of being a woman named Mary Sutton, who lived in Ireland, had several children, and died young in the 1930s. As she got older, Jenny became obsessed with finding out if Mary was real. She started piecing together what she remembered, names, locations, and the layout of Mary's old home. Eventually, she tracked down a town in Ireland that matched. She discovered that a woman named Mary Sutton had lived there and had died, leaving behind children. Jenny eventually reached out to them, now elderly, and met with them in person. And to their surprise, she knew all these intimate details about their lives, their personalities as kids, and even specific incidents from their childhood that had never been published or shared. One of the sons in particular became convinced that Jenny really was his mother reincarnated. He said she had the same mannerisms and emotional connection to them that Mary had. Emad Elawir was just under 2 years old when he started telling his parents about a life he had claimed to have lived in another village about 25 miles from where he was growing up in Lebanon. He gave names, described a yellow car he used to own, and spoke about specific relatives, neighbors, and his former job. His family wasn't all that worried at first, but when Emad suddenly ran to a stranger on the street one day and hugged the man as if he recognized him, and it turned out this person was actually from the town Emad had claimed he'd lived in his past life, well, this intrigued his parents. Eventually, they contacted Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist who'd been studying cases of past life memories. Stevenson documented that Emad made 47 specific statements about his supposed past life. When Stevenson and the Elawir family visited the town, it turned out that 44 of those 47 statements matched up with the real-life story of a man named Ibrahim Boumsi, who died 5 years before Emad was born. Another important detail is that the child Emad would often talk about how thankful he was for being able to walk. Well, Ibrahim died around the age of 25 after spending a year in a sanatorium. He had tuberculosis and was confined to a bed during the final part of his life. Barbro Karlin was a Swedish writer and poet. When she was just 2 years old, though, she started telling her parents that she was Anne Frank. Her family wasn't religious, and she hadn't been taught anything about the Holocaust yet, but Barbro described details of Anne Frank's life that she shouldn't have known. What the secret annex looked like, how the rooms were arranged, and the names of the people who'd lived there. When her parents finally took her to Amsterdam at age 10, she led them straight to the building without a map or a guide. Once inside, she pointed out changes that had been made to the house since she had lived there. She also seemed terrified of men in uniforms, even if they were just policemen on the street. Barbro went on to become a well-known writer and stood by her memories well into adulthood. She said she remembered parts of her death, the fear of being taken, and a sense of injustice that followed her for years. Simei Tetsumus was born with a misshapen right ear, which his parents chalked up to a birth defect, but when he started talking, he claimed it was from being shot in the head in a past life. He'd said he'd been a man named Salim Fasli, a farmer from another village who'd been killed while working in his fields. He recognized people Salim had known, including his widow, and called her by name. He also gave names of Salim's kids and talked about private conversations and daily routines that no stranger would realistically know. Dr. Ian Stevenson, the same researcher who studied Emad Elawir, investigated Simei's case and found it pretty compelling. Salim had in fact been shot dead, and Simei's ear deformity was right where the bullet had entered. The way Simei talked about Salim's life was natural, like he was recalling memories instead of making things up. One of the eeriest parts was how Simei's personality was different from other kids in his village. He was more serious and cautious, traits Salim's family said matched the man that they had remembered. Chennai Chumallay Wong was born in Thailand in 1967. When he was just 3 years old, he started saying he used to be a school teacher named Bua Kai. He claimed he'd been killed while riding his bicycle to work. His story got weirder when his family noticed he had two unusual birthmarks, one on the back of his head and another above his left eye. Well, Bua Kai was a real person who had died. And according to his autopsy report, the entry and exit wounds of the bullet that killed him matched up perfectly with Chennai's birthmarks. Chennai kept insisting he wanted to go home and would say the name of the village where he said he'd lived. Eventually his grandma took him there, and without hesitation he walked up to Bua Kai's old house. He correctly identified the man's parents and described items that had been in the home years earlier. He also remembered details like the name of Kai's bicycle and how he used to teach math. This case takes a turn from creepy to downright chilling. So a 3-year-old boy in Golan Heights, a region between Syria and Israel, started telling his family he'd been killed in a past life. He said he died when he was attacked with an axe and was buried in a nearby field. Elders in the community followed him to the spot, where they dug up a human skeleton with a wound in the skull, right where the boy said the axe had struck. Not only that, but the boy claimed to remember the name of his killer. When they confronted the man, he allegedly confessed. The whole thing was documented by Dr. Eli Lash, a respected physician known for his public health work. He said the boy's memories were disturbingly detailed, right down to the type of axe used. Alright, this one's a bit of a strange rabbit hole. It revolves around a movie that doesn't actually exist, but has a bizarre legend attached to it. So there's this film that supposedly starred the actor Sinbad. If you're like me, you know him from the Arnold Schwarzenegger classic Jingle All the Way. But some also remember Sinbad having been in this movie called Shazam in the 90s, where he played a genie. The premise is that he granted wishes and caused chaos in typical 90s kids movie fashion. A lot of people swear they saw this movie, renting it or watching reruns of it on TV. The only problem is no one can find it now. For years, people have tried to track down any trace of this Shazam movie, but it doesn't seem to exist anywhere in any record. Sinbad himself has even come out and said, like, yeah, I never made that movie. And yet, a surprising number of people are adamant that they remember it. It's become one of the more popular Mandela effects, where a large number of people remember something one way, which turns out to be different, or in this case, not even existing at all. So, what's going on here? Well, one theory is that people are confusing it with another movie called Shazam, starring Shaquille O'Neal as the genie, which was released in 1996. And yeah, I can see people getting confused about the name, but I mean, are all of these people really confusing Sinbad with Shaq? That doesn't really add up. I mean, it's possible, but what if there's a parallel universe where things are just slightly different, and in that universe, there really is a movie called Shazam starring Sinbad, and this very second, there's another version of me filming a video being like, damn, I could have sworn there was a movie called Shazam back in the 90s starring Shaq, but nobody can find it. Next up is Burmeasia, a whole island that completely vanished. This one's wild because it really was a real place, a tiny island in the Gulf of Mexico near the Yucatan Peninsula. You could find it on old maps, and even the Mexican government used to claim that it existed. In fact, it was officially documented as part of Mexico's territory, right in the area where they had a territorial dispute with the US over oil rights. Well, in 1997, a Mexican Navy survey came out saying the island was no longer there. They couldn't find it with any of their modern equipment, even though it was supposed to be there, of course. Having been marked on maps for hundreds of years, the island seemed to have just disappeared though. Well, your first thought is that it probably just sank into the ocean, but that's highly unlikely because the area was relatively shallow and there's actually no sign of the island ever having existed in the first place. So what are some other possibilities? Well, some people think it was deliberately erased from maps as part of some secret government deal. Others say cartographers had been wrong the entire time, and that the island was either never there or is a misidentified rock or sandbar that got labeled as an island. But there's a more fringe idea too, one that ties into the title of this video, of course. The idea that Burmeasia never existed in the first place, and what we're actually dealing with is a glitch or shift between parallel universes. Some say it's like the island slipped through the cracks of time and was never meant to be in our reality at all. Now let's talk about Flight 19, one of the most famous disappearances in aviation history, and of course, it's tied to the Bermuda Triangle. This incident goes back to December 5th of 1945. Flight 19 was a training mission for 5 US Navy bombers flying out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Everything was going well until something went horribly wrong. The pilots lost their bearings and they got disoriented. According to reports, they were never able to get a proper fix on their location, and things quickly went from bad to worse. One of the pilots even reported that the compass wasn't working right, but the entire squadron of 5 planes just vanished, like they were swallowed up by the ocean. No wreckage was ever found, and the Navy couldn't figure out exactly what happened. And on top of that, a rescue plane was sent out to search for them. That plane also went missing. No trace of it was ever found either. The story just adds more mystery when consider how much equipment was searching and still nothing showed up. People started speculating, of course. Some think it was probably a simple navigation error or mechanical failure, nothing too crazy, but others believe that the Bermuda Triangle was involved, that maybe this mysterious region of the ocean is some sort of portal or electromagnetic anomaly that messes with navigation systems, sucking planes and ships into some other dimension or an alternate reality. Others go even further, saying that UFOs or time warps are to blame, but at the end of the day, no one knows what really happened to Flight 19, which is exactly why it's still talked about to this day. The USS Cyclops was this massive American naval vessel that disappeared without a trace in 1918. It was carrying over 300 crew members and a hefty load of manganese ore from the Caribbean to Baltimore, and it vanished somewhere again in the Bermuda Triangle. It's one of the most baffling disappearances in naval history, and what makes it so mysterious is that this wasn't just a random ship lost at sea. It was a huge ship with a solid reputation. It was part of the US Navy during World War II. The Cyclops had been a workhorse for the Navy for years, but when it set out from Barbados in March of 1918, something obviously went wrong. It didn't check in when it was supposed to, and no one heard from it again. The ship was huge, 541 feet long, and it was designed to withstand the rough seas, so it's hard to believe it could just sink without a trace. No wreckage was ever found. Some think a freak storm or a mechanical failure could have caused it to sink. Others believe the ship was sabotaged, maybe by enemies during the war, but because the thing disappeared somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle, some people of course think something stranger may have happened. In 1587, a group of English settlers landed on Rowan Oak Island, which is off the coast of modern-day North Carolina. They were sent to establish a permanent colony, but when a supply ship returned in 1590, they were gone, completely vanished. The settlement was empty, not a single person was left behind. There wasn't even any sign of a struggle. It was as if the whole colony had never even been there in the first place. But they had been. There was a clue that remained. The only sign of them was Croatoan, carved into a tree, the word. Now, the thing is, Croatoan was the name of a nearby island and also the name of a Native American tribe in the area. So some believe the settlers may have tried to integrate with the tribe, but why would they leave behind such a cryptic message? Could they have been forced to leave by some hostile force, or did they just abandon the colony altogether? Maybe they just moved further inland, but then why did they leave no trace of where they went? Of course, there's also the theory that something much stranger happened. Some people wonder the settlers didn't vanish into the woods or the sea at all, but rather slipped into some other dimension, like a glitch in the fabric of time or space. Could Rowan Oak have been one of those spots in history where a tear in reality caused an entire settlement to disappear? Now, I will admit that this one may be a bit of a stretch, but I do think it's kind of fascinating, so I feel like it's worth adding here. You might not even know this, but at one point in US history there were $1,000 bills. The US Treasury printed $1,000 notes. These bills were mainly used for huge bank transfers and business deals, not something people would really carry around in their wallet. They were officially discontinued in 1969, along with other high-value bills like $500 and even $5,000 notes. But a lot of these old bills have just disappeared. The US Treasury estimates that millions of dollars worth of these $1,000 bills are still out there somewhere, but where? I mean, are they all hidden away in private collections? Maybe, but there are some conspiracy theories here too. Some believe that certain bills were deliberately destroyed or hidden by the government to keep the true extent of the nation's wealth under wraps. Others think that the bills might still be circulating under the radar in the hands of shadowy people in underground deals. Next is a very strange phenomenon called the Taos hum, a low-frequency sound that can only be heard by a small percentage of people. But for those who do hear it, it's maddening. This hum is mostly heard around Taos, New Mexico, but there have been reports from all over the world of similar sounds in other locations like parts of England, Canada, and Japan. The hum is described as this low rumbling sound, like a distant diesel engine running constantly. But when investigators try to find the source, well, they can't. It's not coming from machinery or anything else that can be easily identified. People who hear it often report feeling headaches and insomnia though. Scientists have thrown out theories like tinnitus, which is an ear condition that can cause ringing in the ears, but this isn't really a ringing sound. Some wonder if the hum could be related to electromagnetic fields in the area or seismic activity in the Earth's crust, but some people believe the Taos hum may be stranger, caused by interdimensional energy shifting through our world because of some tear in the fabric of reality, a hint of a parallel universe bleeding through. In 1966, two Brazilian men, Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana, were found dead on a hilltop wearing lead masks, the kind used to shield from radiation. A cop found their bodies after they'd gone missing. The men were lying side by side, there were no signs of a struggle, and there was a small bottle of water next to them. But the masks, nobody could figure out what those were about. They were also carrying a note that looked like instructions for some sort of ritual, mentioning radiation and how to use the masks. The whole thing made it seem like they were about to do some sort of experiment, but no one could figure out what. Were they part of some secret cult? Were they trying to contact aliens? Or were they mixed up in some government experiment? Nobody knows, and no one ever found out how they died. This has become a rather infamous story on Reddit. Always reminds me of the Star Trek The Next Generation episode Inner Light. So this guy takes a hit to the head and blacks out. But instead of being out for a few seconds, the guy ends up living what feels like 10 full years in a completely different life. Entirely in his head, of course. In this other version of reality, he meets a woman, falls in love, settles down, starts a family. They go grocery shopping, they argue about bills, they play with their kids in the yard. He remembers what the weather was like, he remembers birthdays. I mean, we're talking real grounded stuff here. This doesn't sound like the type of wacky nonsense that goes on in dreams. Felt like real life. 10 years of it, mind you. But one day in that world, he starts noticing something strange. There's this lamp in the living room, totally normal looking, but it doesn't fit. It starts bugging him. It's like a little glitch. And the more he stares at it, the more everything else starts to feel wrong. And that's when it all starts unraveling. Suddenly he wakes up. He's lying on the ground, surrounded by people. He's back where he was right before he blacked out. Only minutes have passed. But the man is absolutely devastated. The life he just came back to doesn't feel right anymore. He remembers his wife and kids from the other world. He misses them. They weren't real though, but the emotions were. For a long time after, he struggled. He said it felt like he was mourning people who never existed. Now, was this a case of the brain doing weird things under stress? Or did he tap into something else, a different version of his life that's playing out somewhere, a parallel universe. Ken Korczak, a writer and journalist, had one of the most bizarre experiences, writing an article claiming that he'd slipped into a parallel universe. It wasn't like a whole new world, just a slightly different version of his own home and garden. He said the differences were subtle at first. His pets, specifically his cats and chickens, were behaving completely differently than he was used to. It's like they were the same animals, but something was just off about them, like seeing them through a different lens. In his words, it felt like everything in his yard was a few degrees askew. But the weirdest part came when he met this strange female entity. She wasn't human, at least not in the way you'd think. Korczak described her as resembling an elf or a fairy, and she seemed completely at home in this alternate reality. He also described feeling like she was there for a reason, like she was some kind of guide in this parallel world. He spent a lot of time reflecting on it, especially the strange, almost magical feeling of meeting this being. He genuinely believes that he had a real encounter with a parallel version of his home. As someone who's always been interested in the concept of alternate realities too, he dove deep trying to make sense of it. Was this just a hallucination, or did he actually slip into another dimension for a brief moment? In December of 2024, Google made a pretty big announcement about their new quantum chip, Willow. This chip solved a problem in 5 minutes that would have taken even the fastest supercomputers 47 years. What was amazing here though wasn't just how fast the chip was, it's also what the head of Google's quantum AI team, Hartmut Nevins, said about it. He mentioned that this speed might be a sign that their quantum computers are pulling from multiple realities at once. Not just a throwaway comment, he was serious about this. And this ties in with something called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which states that every decision or event causes the universe to split into different versions, creating a parallel reality for each possibility. So when a quantum computer like Willow does a calculation, it's possible that it's tapping into these other universes, running all the possibilities at once, without us even realizing it. And it's not just Google talking along these lines. Other tech companies like IBM and D-Wave have been exploring quantum computing for years, and some think this technology could eventually lead us to understand or even interact with alternate realities. It's not quite science fiction anymore. Quantum computing might be the closest thing we've got to real-world proof that the multiverse could exist. So it's a sweltering day in July of 1954 at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. A man arrives on an international flight and walks up to customs. Everything seems routine. He looks European, speaks multiple languages, and has a legit-looking passport, from a distance that is. Looking at it up close, turns out this passport says he's from a country called Torrid. Never heard of it? Neither had the Japanese officials. They ask him to point it out on a map, and without hesitation he points to the area around where Andorra is, between France and Spain, but he's confused. He insists Torrid has been a country for over 1,000 years. The customs officers are confused, to say the least. Is this a joke? Is the guy just out of his mind? The guy seems just as confused as they are. His passport has stamps from other countries, including past visits to Japan, and he has multiple currencies in his wallet. He even mentions a business trip and says he's got meetings set up with a company in Tokyo, but when the officials call the company, they say they've never heard of him. Same story with the hotel that he claimed to have booked. At this point, they're really not sure what to do with him, so they put him up in a hotel room under guard for the night while they try to figure things out. But by the next morning, he's gone. The room was locked from the outside. There was no way out, at least none that the guards wouldn't have been able to see. To this day, no one knows who he was or where he came from, really. Some think he slipped into our world from another reality and then slipped right back out. Others think this whole story is just a good old-fashioned urban legend, but if we seriously consider the possibility that the multiverse really is a thing, well then this story starts to sound a little less outlandish. The Marawasi stone forest in Peru is one of those places that seems to have a ton of weird stuff happening. People have been talking about strange occurrences there for years, mostly because the place is filled with these huge stone structures that look like they belong to some ancient civilization. But there are also some strange stories surrounding this place. Well, one goes that a group of hikers got a lot more than they bargained for when they camped here. While hanging out, they started to hear some music coming from what seemed like a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It sounded like a celebration. The group looked around and sure enough, they spotted a stone cabin lit up from the inside and they could see people dancing through the windows. The people were dressed like they were from the 1600s, all in old-fashioned clothes. Naturally, one of the hikers decided to check things out. She got closer to the cabin, and the closer she got, the stranger things became. Her friend noticed that she was acting off, like her body was stiff and she wasn't walking right. Got even weirder when she suddenly couldn't move her arm, like she was partially paralyzed. They managed to pull her away from the cabin and she snapped out of it right away. People who know the area say the Marawasi might be some kind of doorway between dimensions or timelines. The idea is that certain spots on Earth might have thin barriers to other worlds, and that cabin could have been a glimpse into some different time. This story comes from a Reddit user named Albert Norman 2069, who shared an experience that left him questioning everything about the world. It had all started on June 28, 2014, a day that seemed normal at first. He'd woken up, brushed his teeth, ate breakfast, and headed out to work. But as he turned on the car radio, something wasn't right. Instead of the usual music, the station was airing a talk show. The host was excitedly talking about something called Victory in the Great War and praising the troops for their role in this victory. At first, the Redditor thought maybe it was some kind of special segment, but the more the host went on, the stranger things got. There was talk of a victory in Italy and something about the Second Great Depression finally coming to an end. He was confused, but he ended up brushing things off. It was probably just fictional. But then things started getting even stranger when he was at work. During lunch, he overheard his coworkers talking about the same victory in Italy, and they kept mentioning the numbers 33 to 13. When he asked what they were talking about, they acted like he was the odd one for not knowing. And when he asked about a coworker named Sam, who didn't seem to be there, no one seemed to remember it. At least something was very off. On his way home, he decided to take a different route to avoid traffic, and that's when he noticed that the city looked worse than he remembered. Buildings were crumbling, some were abandoned, and there were banners everywhere again celebrating this mysterious victory. When he finally got home, he flicked on the news. The anchors were talking about the victory in Italy and how the US was dealing with a war abroad. Europe was also in chaos, and the US was in an even worse depression than the 1930s. Of course, things went back to normal by the next day. So was it just a really vivid dream? Well, possibly. But perhaps Albert Norman 2069 really did spend a day in a much darker version of our own reality. Next up are some pretty strange cave paintings, the Wanginas, some of the most mysterious and downright eerie cave art on Earth. These ancient paintings are found in the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, painted by Aboriginal tribes whose culture has been going strong for over 60,000 years. The Wanginas, according to legend, were sky beings, spirits from the clouds who came down during dream time, said to be this time when the Earth was still being formed. These beings supposedly created the land, animals, people, everything. They taught the Aboriginals how to live, and then they vanished. Some say they returned to the stars, others say they went underground. But, I mean, just look at these cave paintings, the big black eyes, the pale skin, they look like aliens. But this art is estimated to be tens of thousands of years old, long before anyone was talking about aliens, at least not in the modern sense. Kinda makes you wonder, are the Wanginas more than just myth? Did these ancient tribes actually encounter something from beyond the stars, or maybe even from a parallel reality? This final story comes from Reddit user GoodResolve33 and goes as follows. When I was younger, my cousins and I would play in my aunt's basement during major holiday parties. Parents would be upstairs and we would all just hang out and mess around in the basement, entertaining ourselves with whatever junk was down there. Well, there was a metal door down there with a bolt lock that we never touched. But one day, we unlocked the door and we saw a major boxing event going on. I'm talking Jumbotron, bright lights, arena, and a major crowd. Everything seemed to freeze when we opened the door though. People in the crowd turned around to look at us. Fighters stopped fighting, the referee signaled us out, and we saw shadows in the crowd running toward us. It all sounds crazy, but I remember how scared we were. We shut the door, ran upstairs, and sat in the living room with our parents. I remember them being like, "What's going on with these guys?" As we sat in the living room silent, crapping ourselves because we thought we were going to get in trouble. Fast forward to much later, I tried to tell my parents, and they swear that I imagined it. I thought I did too for the longest time, until randomly, one of my cousins from that day hit me up after so long of not communicating, only to bring up that same event, detail for detail as I described, and remembered it. I go back to that house to check out the door. Across the door is the neighbor's basement door, since it was a duplex, and stairs leading up the metal basement doors that come out to the backyard. Not sure what the F that was, and I promise you I'm not that crazy. I get goosebumps thinking about the situation sometimes because it makes absolutely zero sense. In 1851, a man calling himself Yoparvorin was picked up by local authorities in the town of Frankfurt-Oder, and what was then Prussia. He didn't speak German fluently, but he understood it well enough to communicate, and what he told them left everyone confused. He claimed to be from a country called Luxaria, which he said was in a region called Sacria, supposedly somewhere in the Eastern Hemisphere. Never heard of it? Well, yeah, nobody else did either. It wasn't on any map, it wasn't part of any empire, and it never has been. It didn't exist. But Yopar was dead serious. He said he was searching for his long-lost brother, and when asked to show his documents, he produced papers written in a completely unknown language. He also claimed to be fluent in multiple languages, some of which had no record of ever existing either, like Luxarian and Abramian. Eventually, authorities labeled him a lunatic and sent him off for further investigation, and that's the last the world ever heard of him. There was never any follow-up. If this guy ever really did exist, he probably ended up in an asylum, and if you know anything about mental institutions at the time, you know they were basically hell on earth. Makes sense he was never heard from again. Was this guy mentally unstable though, or is there really a chance that he somehow slipped from an alternate reality, a different version of Earth where Luxaria was as real as Germany? And in this alternate Earth, is there a more handsome version of me doing a video just like this, but talking about how Yoparvorin mysteriously vanished into thin air and was never seen again? In the heart of Liverpool, there's a street called the Bold Street. Nothing crazy at first glance, just shops, cafes, people going about their day, but ask around and you'll likely hear whispers about something very strange. People slipping through time. One of the most famous stories comes from 1996. A guy named Frank was walking with his wife near Bold Street. She popped into a bookstore and he strolled ahead to a music shop. As he crossed the street, everything suddenly changed. The modern cars vanished, the noises around him dulled, and when he looked around, he was standing in what looked like 1950s Liverpool. People were dressed in post-war clothes, and there were old-school shop fronts where modern businesses should have been. He even saw a store called Crips, which hadn't existed in decades. A few moments later, the world flickered again, and he was back in the present like nothing had happened. Frank swore that this happened though, and he's not the only one. There are dozens of reports from people who say they've walked Bold Street and wound up in the past. Some just for a few seconds, others for minutes. Is it just a coincidence, hallucinations, or is Bold Street sitting on some kind of weird wrinkle in time, a natural glitch in the matrix, if you will? In 1979, two British couples, Geoff and Pauline Simpson and Len and Cynthia Gisby, were driving through France on their way to a holiday in Spain. While passing through Paris, they decided to stop for the night. They pulled off the main road and found this charming, old-fashioned hotel. Nothing fancy, but it was cozy and heavy wooden furniture. No modern conveniences though, like none. The beds didn't have pillows even, it was just bolsters. The windows had these old wooden shutters, odd but charming in a vintage kind of way. They even had dinner at the attached restaurant, where they were served a very basic, kind of old school meal by staff in these outdated uniforms. The whole night also only cost them about 19 francs total. That's about $21.50 US. Even in the 70s, that was suspiciously cheap. They tried to find the hotel again on their way back through Paris, but it was gone completely. They retraced their route. They asked locals. Nobody had ever heard of this place though. The road they remembered taking didn't seem to exist anymore. They later checked their photos from the trip, but the ones they took of the hotel were gone. They just weren't there. But both couples swore up and down that this was real. So did they spend the night in a building that slipped forward through time, or did they slip backward into some echo of a Paris that no longer was there? In 2009, a guy named James Richards claimed he had a very weird experience in California. According to him, he was out driving near Del Porto Canyon with his dog when it took off chasing a rabbit. He ran after it, tripped, hit his head, and blacked out. When he came to, he was in what looked like a regular room with furniture, but there were also machines he didn't recognize. A man introduced himself as Jonas and said that while on a work-related trip from a dimensional travel agency, he had used the machine to transport the unconscious Richards to this parallel Earth in order to help him. This alternate version of Earth was very similar to ours, but with some key differences. One being that in Jonas's world, the Beatles were all still alive and making music. Naturally, James didn't believe it until Jonas gave him a cassette tape. The label said Everyday Chemistry. It was a compilation of Beatles songs that didn't exist here. James brought the tape back with him when he returned to our world, and he posted the whole thing on a website he made. The music's on there. It does kind of sound like the Beatles' version of like Pink Floyd's Division Bell, like just music they would have done in their later years. Is this just a really creative art project or a hoax though? Or is there a chance there's really a whole Beatles album online from a parallel universe? Back in the 12th century, the quiet village of Woolpit in England got a visit from two very strange kids. A brother and sister showed up out of nowhere, looking completely lost. They were also bright green, not a sickly green, a kind of like Shrek hue. The locals were kind of freaked out, but they took them in. The kids didn't speak any recognizable language. They were terrified of sunlight, and they refused to eat anything except raw beans for days. Now, eventually they adjusted a bit. The boy unfortunately got sick and died not long after, but the girl survived and slowly learned to speak English. And that's when she started telling people some pretty strange things. She said they came from a place called St. Martin's Land, where everything had a greenish twilight and the sun never fully shone. According to her, the two of them had been tending to their father's flock when they heard this loud noise and suddenly found themselves in Woolpit. Were these mysterious green children from some different culture and just got lost, or had they somehow wandered out of a parallel world? In 1957, something terrible happened in the quiet town of Hexham, England. Two sisters, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock, were hit by a car and killed while walking to church. Their parents, understandably, were devastated, but about a year later, the mother got pregnant again, and in 1958, she gave birth to twins again. Gillian and Jennifer, they named them. Now, from the start, there were some odd things. Jennifer had birthmarks in the exact same place as Jacqueline had them, and as they got older, the twins started asking for toys that had belonged to their dead sisters, toys they'd never seen before. They even knew their names. They also seemed to have memories of places they'd never been, like a school the older girls had attended. One time the twins pointed out a park they claimed to recognize, saying, "That's where we used to play." By the time they turned 5, though, the memories began to fade. The girls grew up like normal kids, eventually forgetting all the strange things they used to say, but their father became convinced that Joanna and Jacqueline had been reincarnated into their twin sisters. Was it a case of parental grief mixing with coincidence, or did something actually transfer over? Like two souls refusing to move on, jumping right back into the same family. A lot of people who've heard this story kinda think so. And that's why the story of the Pollock twins became one of the most famous reincarnation cases ever recorded. In 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was driving home late at night in Minnesota when his car went into a ditch near the town of Lind. He wasn't hurt, he was just stuck, so he called his parents around 1:30 a.m. and asked them to come get him. He said he was near Lind. When they drove out there, they couldn't find him. He stayed on the phone with them for nearly 47 minutes, calmly describing where he was walking. Then suddenly, in the middle of the call, Brandon said, "Oh, and the line went dead. That was the last time anyone heard from him. His car was eventually found, but they never found a body, and to this day, Brandon Swanson's disappearance remains completely unsolved. In 1901, two English school teachers, Anne Moberly and Charlotte Jourdain, took a trip to Paris. While visiting the Palace of Versailles, they decided to explore the gardens near the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette's old stomping grounds. But as they wandered, something felt kinda off. The air got heavy, the atmosphere changed. The people they passed were suddenly wearing 18th century clothing. One man in a wide brim hat looked downright ghostly even. They claimed the place felt lifeless and and surreal, like walking into a painting. But then, out of nowhere, everything snapped back to normal. Later, they became convinced that they had time-slipped straight into pre-revolution France, possibly 1792. They even claimed to have seen Marie Antoinette herself sketching by the grass. They wrote a book about it under fake names, and the story became relatively famous. Some believed it, some said they were just delusional or making it up entirely, but both women stuck to their story for the rest of their lives. Were they hallucinating, or did they somehow catch a rip in time and stumble into the past? There's a patch over the South Atlantic Ocean called the South Atlantic Anomaly, and it's kinda like the Bermuda Triangle, but for space. So satellites that pass over it glitch out. Laptops on the International Space Station will sometimes crash. Astronauts report seeing flashes of light even when their eyes are closed. Why? Because in this spot, Earth's magnetic field is weirdly weak, like dangerously weak, which allows more cosmic radiation to pour in. NASA even has to shut off instruments when passing over it because they can't guarantee accurate readings. Some satellites have flat out died after taking too many passes, and here's the freakiest part: the anomaly seems to be growing and splitting. And conspiracy theorists, they got plenty of theories. Ancient alien tech buried under the ocean, a secret underground base, a rift to another dimension, possibly.